Hey everybody, this is David Andrade from Theory Animation, and in this tutorial, we're going to animate a character named George. Now, unlike our previous tutorials where we went from a Maya to Blender workflow, this one is going to be solely focused on animating a run cycle in Blender. We're going to cover my workflow, like using the grease pencil to think up some ideas. We're also going to go through the principles of animation, and we're going to make George run, because look at George. Just look at him. Isn't he cute? I hope you love this video, and if you do, subscribe. And if you have any questions, comments, critiques, or criticism, please throw them down in the comments and I'll get to you. Let's get started. Alright, so just some general housekeeping here. Make sure that everything is set up properly in your dimensions. I like to animate at 30 frames a second, so I'm going to set it to 30 FPS. Under stamp, I'm going to make sure frames checked. And under output, I'm just going to type in georgerun.mov. Cool. Now those of you who've seen the previous tutorials know that I really like the dope sheet because it's a really handy way to time out stuff in Blender. And when we're using the grease pencil, it's a really handy way to time out your grease pencil drawings. I'm going to right click on here to maximize the area. That way I can see just George. And if you scroll down, you can also turn on display only render. That way I won't see any of the controls and I can just focus on George. I'm going to make a new layer. I'm going to go to white. Yeah, we should make it kind of thick. I'm going to turn on onion skinning as well. That way I can see previous frames. And this thing down here will show me how many frames before. And I'm going to actually just say 1. So let's pretend our ground is right where George's feet are. And I'm going to start with a grease pencil. Make sure draw is clicked. And now for the grease pencil, it's just to get an idea across. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's just really to be freeing and to give you some ideas. So this is going to be his contact position, something like this. And this foot here is going to be trailing over here. Now his hands are going to be back here. And here's going to be his other hand. All right, so he's going to be contacting the ground right about here. Now, without doing anything else, you can hit the right arrow twice. I like to do 2 times. It makes it a little bit easier to time out stuff. And this is going to be the down position. Now, if your onion skin doesn't come up, you can go over here and make sure that this is up to like 2. Okay, so now remember, this is going to be the down position. So his body is right about here. And George's leg is taking the full brunt of the weight. And this foot's about here. This hand's going to start coming back a little bit. And this one's going to start moving forward a little bit. Now why? Well, it's torque. Your body's basically twisting to get the full brunt of the force. So now we're in the passing position. He's going to go up a little bit, believe it or not. And passing position is just that. That's when one foot passes in front of the other. So this one foot's going to be passing, the other foot's going to be coming back. These hands are also switching. So it looks kind of messy, but that's all right. I'm going to draw again. Now that was a passing position, so the next one is the up position. Now this is when the leg is fully extended. And his leg is delivering so much force that it's twisting George. And the hands are almost in their final position. And if you ever want to erase stuff, there is an erase button. So we're just going to erase some of this. The other hand should be coming out by now. And this leg, this leg is fully extended. And this other leg has passed it already. Now, we can right click and go to Tile. Here's the dope sheet. You can just click this button, go to Grease Pencil. you'll see the first drawing over here. You're going to zoom in a little bit. You can hit Shift D and drag it all the way over, right about there. Going to maximize again, turn off onion skinning. If you just use your right arrow keys and left arrow keys, you can see how he's running. Now, obviously we zoom back all of a sudden, but that's okay. It's just to get an idea of what's going on. All right, it's not meant to be perfect, but it gives us an idea of what we can do. Okay, so now that our thumbnails are done, we're actually going to move into animating this guy. So I'm going to turn off only render. Now, if for some reason your grease pencil disappears, don't panic. You can just click on this little browse button and find it. Mine's called G Pencil. Make sure, by the way, that auto key is set, and I like to use lock rot scale, GIF, whatever. Don't hate. I'm actually going to go to the first frame. Maximize area again. If this grease pencil is a little too thick for you, you can always drop the opacity, you can drop the thickness. That way it doesn't really get in the way. And I also have onion skinning off because now I just want to concentrate on each drawing individually. You got to pick a leg, so I'm going to say that his left leg is the one that's going to be going forward. And if I can't get to that exact position, or if I can get farther than that position, then that's okay. The idea is just to get the feeling just right. And if you're curious on how we actually built this, we used a Blender add-on called Rigify. For those of you who've used Maya, you'll probably recognize the setup machine, and it works more or less the same way. Now his hips at this point are about the average height that they're going to be. They're not at the lowest, they're not at the highest, they're just at the middle. And since his left one's going forward, his right hand should be actually coming straight ahead. Now I'm using a system called IK, also FK. The difference between the two is that IK means I can move the hand or the foot, whereas with FK I'd have to move the upper arm, then the forearm, and then the hand to get the position I want. Now IKs have pole vectors. These are these little floating things, and we can just kind of adjust them how we want them. He has such huge hands, so we might have to adjust our initial idea. Now, to not drive you crazy, we're speeding through the rest of this. That way you can just kind of get a rough idea. And to violate my own rule of using fuse controls as possible, I'm going to make sure that his mouth is open as wide as it can be. So like I said, I'm just speeding through this now so you can get a rough idea of what I'm doing. I'm just trying to match the poses that I had drawn in originally. Nothing too crazy. It just kind of gives you an idea of what I'm kind of going for. George has some funny weights. As you can tell, when you move his shoulder, it moves the teeth. It's still a work in progress. Alright, so now we've done our contact, our down, our passing, and our up position. If we go back to our contact, I can hit this little copy button, go all the way towards the end, and hit paste opposite. now I have an opposite contact position. As you can see, it starts to get a little funny here, right? It bounces back naturally because the passing position should actually be a little farther back. So let's do that real quick. Let's just adjust as we need to. I don't think we need the grease pencil anymore, so let me go up and turn it off. And let's see what we got. Cool. Not perfect, but it gets you a rough idea of how George is going to run. So now that we have a few poses down for George, we're going to switch this grease pencil back to dope sheet. Make sure everything has a key on it. You don't want anything surprising us. So now that we've animated one side, all we need to do is copy one side to the other and just paste opposite. So here we are at frame number 9. So we're going to go to frame 3, hit A, copy, go to frame 11, paste the opposite, go to frame 5, copy, go to 13 and paste the opposite, go to frame 7, copy, go to frame 15, paste the opposite, and go to 9, copy, go to frame 17, paste the opposite. Check that out. Now we have George running. But again, these are just poses. So the next thing we're going to do is time it out. So what I'm going to do here in the dope sheet is I'm going to make sure everything's selected by hitting A, go to frame 1, and this is a 30 frame cycle. So I'm just going to put my mouse at the end here and hit S and drag it all the way to 30. Now, of course, you know, if I just move it a little bit, things will snap kind of funny. I'll just pick a spot and go with it. Now, if I hit A, I can see George running. There's a lot of work that we need to do, but it gives you a rough idea of how George can run at this point. Here's what it looks like when you just render it out. It's kind of funny and kind of swimmy, and of course, stuff kind of snaps all over the place, and it just looks weird, and the hand goes all over the place. Don't worry, we're going to get to that. That's the process of cleaning up and going through the graph editor. Now, I want to use the graph editor to clean this guy up. And I want to hide some things, so I'm not looking at everything. So let me move this up a little bit. And I'm going to turn off a bunch of these things. I just want to focus on his body. And we're going to switch this to the graph editor. Now, I like to work on a couple of controls, or even just one control at a time. And I also like to set these ends to vector, so I can get as sharp as I can down there. Now the Y location is him going forward and backwards, so I'm going to minimize it a little bit. I'm just going to hit A, I'm going to put my mouse up here, hit S and then Y, and just minimize it some, because I don't really want him going forward and backward that much. I also didn't put any rotations on here. I left the rotations for his torso. So let's move on to those. You can always hit O to clean up things really quick. It's really handy. Now, if you've never dealt with Quaternions before, they're really different than Euler. It really takes a little playing around to kind of get used to them. And because he's going to be twisting so much, one thing we could do is just kill all of this and just have it blend nicely from one end to the other. This way you're guaranteed to get a nice smooth transition between the two. Also, if you don't like clicking on that, you can go to the armature panel and turn on X-ray, and that way you'll be able to see all the controls. Now, how does a quaternion work? Well, the easiest way to think about it is that a quaternion will always try to find the simplest angle to get there. Now this W sort of acts as a limiter for everything, so everything usually stops at about 180 degrees. Also, you notice that there are not degrees. They are just regular 0 to 1 values. It really forces you to think differently, but the advantage is you won't have gimbal lock. And trust me, after years of gimbal lock in Maya, this is a welcome addition. To deal with quaternions in Blender, what I usually like to do is just adjust them a little bit and see what happens. If I really need something, I'll just adjust it in the actual 3D view, and I'll see what happens in the graph editor. For example, on this one right here, like what is this doing? So I can just pull this up and down and I can see what's going on here. But just like Euler, any weird bumps in quaternions will get you weird bumps in animation. So whenever I get stuff like this, I just kill it all. And if I really need something, I'll just animate it in the 3D view. Check that one out. Same thing, I'm just gonna wipe all these out and I'll get this nice smooth transition. And if I really need something specific, I'll just do it in the 3D view. Now I know this is probably blowing your mind, so I'm gonna just make a quick cube and show you what I mean. So I'm gonna hit I a couple times and I'm gonna set my Z to 360 and hit I. Now if I just scrub, you'll notice that the cube turns all the way around. See that? But now with Quaternion, it won't. So let's just make a quick little adjustment here so that we know that this is the corner. I'm going to hit I. In Quaternion, you can pick it over here on the right. And I'm just going to rotate it so that that little edge comes all the way around. Right about there. Okay? And I'm going to scrub it. And you notice it just goes backwards. Now why is that? It's because Quaternion is trying to find the easiest, simplest way to get there. Well, maybe not the easiest, simplest, but at least mathematically the simplest. So how would you do it? Well, what I like to do is I'll animate it going about half the way, then going about 3/4 of the way, and then again back to all the way around. And of course, you could mathematically do this and type in numbers so you can get it just right on and perfectly. We could set this to -1, set this to 0. That way it'll perfectly come back to it. But hopefully this gives you a rough idea of how to actually do a full rotation in Quaternion. And it is slowing down a bit, so you would probably want to set all of this stuff to vector so that it maintains a nice constant transition all the way around. But the trade-off is this. It's funny rotations or gimbal lock. And having suffered through gimbal lock for a long period of time, I'll take funny rotations and just deal with it. Because honestly, gimbal lock happens more often than not. So we start to see that the bumps are starting to go away, but man, those arms are a huge problem. Don't worry, we'll get to them next. Now what we need to work on are those arms. Those arms are ridiculous. So let's get in there and let's clean them up. Over here in the rig layers, I'm just going to turn off the head. Whoa. I'm going to turn off the torso. Oh gosh. Turn off the legs, turn off the root. And just focus on these arms. Okay, so let's calculate a motion path. And we're going to say heads to 30. Click OK. And voila, look at that. We got a motion path. Now we'll get to the exploding wrist here in a second. What I really want to work on is this translation over time. Now, to not drive you crazy, we're speeding through the rest of this. Arcs really make motion beautiful. Most natural things, in fact, move in arcs. Even some robotic things have small little arcs in them. Arcs are good. You'll notice that even though I have the graph editor up, I like to do a lot of my changes in 3D view. I feel like 3D view makes things a little bit easier to understand. This push and pull process, this finding it process, is actually what takes the longest amount of time in animation. You're constantly looking for what looks good. Of course, don't get blind to it. If you look in the side view, you might get stuck and say, oh, that looks great. But in the front view, it looks terrible. So I always like to switch between the views and make sure that everything looks good in all views. All right, so there we go. You also notice as you start to get better at this, you'll get some really nice figure eights in your animation. It takes a lot of practice to plan out your figure eights, but once you really get them down, you can get some beautiful arcs and some beautiful motion in your animation, and suddenly it's starting to look a lot better than that jaggedy or really rough animation that you started with. Okay, so now let's work on this hand. Now here's this offending curve, and we're just going to delete it. Here's another one, I'm going to delete it. And look at that. Nice. Now remember, we changed these end positions, so make sure that you copy and paste them correctly. And think like a squirrel's tail. You know, the body moves one way, the tail drags behind it. And that's all I want for this hand. We're coming down on an angle, but it should be following a little bit better. So let's just rotate it. So right about here, right, it should be dragging in this direction because that's where it's coming from. Cool. Now if you notice that the elbow's doing a lot of funny stuff too. So let's click on this elbow. It's this IK pole vector that's floating out here, and we're going to just adjust it. Now if you've never used a pole vector before, what it does is tell the IK hand where to point the elbow at. So there you go, just a few adjustments to it, and deleting some offending keyframes, and you got a decent little hand going back and forth. Well, not really little. His hands are actually pretty huge. I think they're actually bigger than Clovis's head. So to speed things up, I'm just going to copy everything I did on the left arm over to the right. Okay, so what I ended up doing to speed things up is I copied all the cleanup that we did to the left hand to the right hand. Now I know the hands still kind of go through the ground and everything, but the general idea is there. We have better arcs, we have better spacing, you can see how everything flows a little bit better with the hands. The fingers kind of trail behind it, so it's looking much better. Now what I'd like to do is move on to the legs. So you're probably asking, what is it that we actually need to do to clean up the feet, because they actually look pretty decent. Well, they're not moving at a constant rate, and that's going to be the thing that kills us. Because if we were to actually play this animation over a length of time and move him around the floor, his feet would slide. Now there's a couple of tricks to clean that up, and we're going to go over those right now. So hit A, and let's use his left foot. Since everything's mirrored, we're just going to use his left foot. We're going to go to the contact pose, and I'm going to click here. I'm going to hit Shift A. I'm going to make an empty. If you can't make an empty, make sure that you're in object mode. Make sure the root is on, and I'm going to key this position first. Then I'm going to go all the way until about the heel leaves the ground. So right about there. That's the last position. And I'm going to move him forward just a little bit. Okay. Now I'm going to go to the Y location. And I have this nice curve, but I don't want it to be a curve. I want it to be constant. So switch it to vector. And just watch what happens. You know, it's not bad, actually. He stays roughly in the same area, but he does slide a lot. If we were to take this Y location and hit Shift E and go to linear extrapolation, you'll really start to see it happening over time. His feet will slide all over the place. It's almost like he's ice skating. But we can fix that. Don't worry. It's going to take a little bit of time, but we can fix it. Now, there's a lot of tricks to actually how to fix it. I like to do everything manually, just actually viewing stuff. So let's go to, say, frame 15, which is about half of the walk cycle. And it's at 1.5, whatever. So let's change that to 1.5, right? I'm going to delete this. So now every 30 frames, 1 second, he walks, or runs, I guess. He runs 3 blender units. And that looks right. We don't have to stretch the foot too much, and it looks just about the right speed he would be running at. Now that we know that he runs about 3 blender units, we could just use the translates on this, But the real problem is that he's also rotating, so his heel's going to go all over the place. I want to make sure that the rotations on this foot are spot on. I don't want any weird pops or anything like that. This happens a lot to new animators. They'll start cleaning up one part of the thing and then they realize that, oh man, the rest doesn't work. And then as soon as you change the rest, it throws everything off. It's really going to help to keep the rotations as still as I can for when his foot's down here. And like I said, I'm just going to eyeball this. I want to make sure that his heel is always here. And don't worry about the toes. We'll get to those too. Okay, now at this point, the foot launches off. I want to do the same thing that I did with the hands and draw a motion path. I'm going to switch these keyframes right here to vector, because at this point my rotations are still. That is, nothing else is rotating. Great, look at that. So now his foot sticks right there. Cool, so now his foot is generally in the same area. We need to clean up this toe though, because look at these curves. These things are outrageous. And if this thing gets in the way, you can just turn it off right there. Now you're going to ask me, David, how do I know where my controls are? And I'm going to tell you, you don't need to know. Because when you hit G on something, you can just move it around. And when you hit R on something, you can just rotate it. And if you want to limit it on an axis, all you have to do is hit X, Y, or Z. Okay, so now the foot lands pretty well. But what about this ridiculous knee of ours? Let's just adjust it a little bit. And make sure that his knee is moving the right way. You know, I don't like how the knee twists in air. There we go. That's a little bit better. That way the knee's not twisting all over the place in the air. Cool. So now the knee doesn't break. Okay, so how do we copy over all this to the other foot, since our left foot looks so good? Well, first of all, make sure here in the graph editor, everything is on. Just hit the V for visibility, right? Okay, so now everything's on. Now, what I do is actually pretty silly. Make sure there's a key in the beginning. Make sure there's a key at the end. I'm going to go to the right foot, and I'm just going to make sure everything is gone except for the first frame. Just going to delete all of this stuff. I'm just going to hit copy, paste opposite, move to the next frame, copy and paste opposite, copy and paste opposite, copy, paste opposite, copy and paste opposite. And you get the idea. Okay, so now that we've done all this copy and paste opposite, you'll notice that both feet move exactly the same way. Not exactly how people run, nor monsters. For the right foot, we're going to select everything. I'm going to select it all down here in the graph editor. I'm going to hit G, X, negative 15. All right. And now I'm going to grab everything from frame 1 all the way out to whatever that is. Hit Shift D, then X to lock it moving on the X. And just drag it all the way over. Now what that's done is shifted everything down by 15 frames. And I can also just delete this stuff. Now you notice his foot slides a little bit, and that's probably because over here in the Y location, everything's just a little bumpy. I'm going to set it to vector. There we go. Nice and still. And this is what you get. Awesome. So now you have George running. Well, that wasn't too hard, was it? Now, as always, we didn't cover everything, but we did cover quite a few concepts here. We looked over how to use the grease pencil to thumbnail out some ideas. We used a dope sheet to time things. We used a graph editor to adjust curves and clean up curves. We talked about quaternions. And generally, we animated this giant monster running. Pretty cool, huh? Okay, but this isn't where it stops. I'm really curious what you guys can do with George. So, Theory Animation is going to release George for all of you guys to play with. You'll find the download links below, and you can just take George and make him run. In fact, maybe that's what we'll call this whole thing. We'll call it Make George Run. So if you animate George running, hashtag it, Make George Run, or something similar like on a YouTube video called Make George Run. I'm really curious what you guys can come up with. And as always, feel free to share it and put it in the comments and video responses and all that funny YouTube stuff. Like, maybe you animated him doing this. Or maybe he's doing it this way. Well, you get the idea. If you have any questions or comments, or if you absolutely love the video, please leave some feedback, subscribe, send me an email. I'm here to listen. And if you absolutely hated the video, then send me an email. Let me know how we can make this better. All right, everyone. Until next time, this is David Andrade from Theory Animation.